Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean lies a structure that defies everything we know about geology. When Dr. Kenji Tanaka's drill touched its surface, the Earth itself screamed back. The perfect sine wave pulsing from within wasn't random noise, it was a heartbeat. A living machine, disguised as ancient stone, has been protecting our world for millennia. But what happens when humanity accidentally breaks the only thing standing between us and catastrophic destruction? The hum of the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, Seismology Lab, was Kenji Tanaka's favorite sound. It was the sound of order, a symphony of cooling fans and server racks processing a predictable world. Each monitor on the wall-sized display before him was a tributary of data, flowing in clean, comprehensible streams from sensors buried deep in the Japan Trench. It was a river of logic, its currents and eddies governed by the immutable laws of physics. Here, in this temple of brushed steel and humming circuits, chaos was held at bay. Kenji, his face illuminated by the cool blue glow of the graphs, took a slow, deliberate sip of his genmaicha tea. The roasted aroma was a small organic comfort in his sterile domain. With the precision of a surgeon, he used a stylus to annotate a digital chart, flagging a microfracture event near the Ogasawara Plateau. It was a beautiful signal, a jagged, chaotic burst that decayed exactly as the models predicted. Messy, natural, true. "Sensei?" a voice asked from behind him. It was Ryo, a junior analyst barely out of university, his face still round with a youthful eagerness Kenji had long since traded for professional rigor. "What is it, Ryo?" Kenji didn't turn around. His focus remained on the data streams, his eyes scanning for the slightest deviation from the norm. "I was just on that geology forum again, the one the American academics frequent. They were still arguing about the Yonaguni Monument." Kenji let out a short, sharp sigh, the sound barely audible over the servers. "Are they?" "Yes," Ryo pressed on, undeterred. "They were saying the right angles. The terraced formations, they can to all be natural." One professor from UCLA posted a sonar scan analysis arguing that the erosion patterns are inconsistent with uniform sandstone weathering. Without looking away from his monitor, Kenji muttered the words that had become his mantra, his shield against all forms of convenient fantasy. "Geology doesn't use a T-square, Ryo. It uses time and pressure, millions of years of immense indifferent force grinding stone into shape. Nature has no obligation to be asymmetrical." He finally turned, his gaze sharp and critical. "There are 100 perfectly rational papers explaining the orthogonal jointing in the Yaeyama sandstone group. They are seeing faces in the clouds because they want to. Stick to the data. The data doesn't want anything." Ryo's enthusiasm visibly deflated. "Yes, sensei." He retreated to his own workstation, leaving Kenji alone once more with his clean, predictable world. He took another sip of tea. Faces in the clouds. That was the perfect description for it. The human brain, pathetic, desperate need to find patterns, to impose meaning on a universe that was gloriously, beautifully meaningless. He was a guardian of that truth. He kept the noise out and the signal pure. An hour later, the quiet rhythm of his work was broken. A small, almost imperceptible alert flashed in the bottom corner of his peripheral vision. It was a low-priority notification from Sensor Array 734, a small, almost forgotten deployment near the coast of Yonaguni Island itself, placed there years ago to monitor coastal subsidence. Normally, Kenji would have archived the alert without a second glance. Micro-tremors in that region were as common as rain, but something made him pause. The alert icon wasn't the angry red of a seismic event. It was a calm, pulsing blue he'd never seen before. Curiosity, that most dangerous and essential of scientific instincts, stirred. He clicked it. The data window expanded, and Kenji's world tilted on its axis. There was no chaotic signature of shifting rock, no jagged, angry spike of a microquake. Instead, a waveform scrolled across the screen in a line of impossible perfection. It was a sine wave, as pure and clean as if it had been generated by a laboratory function generator. It rose and fell with a placid, mathematical grace that had no place in the messy reality of geophysics. The wave pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, one peak every 1.2 seconds. A trough, then another peak 1.2 seconds later. Again and again. It was the slow, steady beat of a resting heart. Kenji leaned forward, his teacup forgotten. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his desk. This couldn't be right. His first thought, the immediate reflexive defense of his worldview, was a malfunction. A faulty hydrophone, a power supply feedback loop. He worked with feverish intensity, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He ran a full remote diagnostic on array 734, all systems green. He cross-referenced the signal with the 3 adjacent sensors in the array. They all picked it up, fainter, but identical in frequency and rhythm. It wasn't a single faulty sensor. It was a real localized phenomenon. He pulled up the acoustic spectrum analysis. The signal was focused, narrow band, centered precisely at 12 Hz, on the very edge of human hearing. Too low for most boat engines. Too regular for any known biological source. A whale song was a complex symphony. This was a single pure note held for eternity. He ran a signal attenuation model to triangulate the source. The computer crunched the numbers, the delay between the sensors mapping a location in 3-dimensional space. The result made the breath catch in his throat. The signal S point of origin was less than 200 meters from the so-called Yonaguni Monument. And it wasn't tea coming from the water. It was coming from beneath the seafloor, from within the rock itself. This was not data. This was a violation. The clean ordered numbers on his screen were describing an event that was fundamentally, horrifyingly disordered. It was a perfect circle in a world of jagged edges, a whisper of intention in the mindless noise of the cosmos. Kenji felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was the fear of the unknown, an emotion he thought he had long since reasoned out of existence. Geology doesn't use a T-square, but something, deep beneath the waves, apparently did. The next morning, Kenji stood before Director Hagiwara's immense mahogany desk. The office was the antithesis of the lab, where the lab was sterile steel and functional plastics. This room was warm wood, plush leather, and quiet, imposing power. A vast window looked out over the Pacific, the endless blue a testament to the scale of the forces Jamstack was meant to study, not control. Director Hagiwara was a man built like a boulder, with a face that looked like it had been weathered by political storms rather than sea spray. He had the hands of a fisherman and the eyes of a CEO. He represented the point where the pure pursuit of science collided with the messy realities of funding, reputation, and national interest. Kenji held out a tablet displaying the impossible waveform, its perfect blue sine wave, a stark anomaly against the office-S earthy tones. Director, look at this. It S from array 734. The signal is constant, rhythmic, and its origin point is subterranean, directly adjacent to the Yonaguni site. Hagiwara didn't even glance at the tablet. His attention was fixed on a glossy prospectus on his own desk, its cover emblazoned with the logo of the Idemitsu Corporation. He sighed, a sound of paternal disappointment that set Kenji's teeth on edge. "Tanaka-san," he began, his voice smooth and final. "We're already aware of the signal." Kenji froze. "You are?" It's acoustic interference from the Idemitsu Corporation's new deep-sea resource platform. They were using a proprietary sonic drill for core sampling. We've been briefed. He finally looked up from the prospectus, his eyes cool and uninviting. "It's a non-issue." Kenji stared, baffled. "Director, with respect, that's impossible. A drill, even a sonic one, would produce a complex, high-frequency signal, full of harmonic distortion and mechanical noise. This, he gestured emphatically at the tablet, is a pure, low-frequency sine wave. It is acoustically the opposite of industrial activity. The waveform is fundamentally unnatural. Unnatural is a word for poets, doctor, not for scientists, Hagiwara said, his tone hardening. Idemitsu assures us their technology is revolutionary. Their contributions to this agency are also revolutionary, I might add. Their new grant is funding the entire Triton Buoy project. He leaned back in his chair, a clear gesture of dismissal. Don't waste agency resources chasing phantom signals, Kenji. It's bad for our reputation. It makes us look like that American professor on the internet, seeing faces in the clouds. We deal in facts, not fantasies. Kenji felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't skepticism. Skepticism was a tool for finding truth, the whetstone on which hypotheses were sharpened or broken. This was the opposite. This was dogma. This was a preordained conclusion, an answer supplied before the question was even properly asked. Hagiwara wasn't just ignoring the data. He was ordering Kenji to do the same. He was being told to unsee what he had seen. He stood there for a moment, the tablet heavy in his hand, the perfect blue wave pulsing on its screen like a silent, insistent heartbeat. He was a man of evidence, a priest of the empirical, and the evidence was telling him one thing, while the entire institution he served was telling him another. He had just been handed the most significant, rule-violating piece of data in his entire career, and he was being ordered to bury it. Disobedience did not come naturally to Kenji Tanaka, but the scientific method was a higher authority than any director, and its first commandment was to question. Hagiwara had given him an answer. Kenji's duty was to try and break it. That night, under the lonely hum of the emergency lighting in his lab, he committed an act of intellectual rebellion. He worked not with anger, but with a cold, focused precision, his fingers a blur across the keyboard as he built a complex filtering algorithm from scratch. He obtained the full acoustic profile of the Idemitsu Corporation S sonic drill, a messy, chaotic signature, full of broad-spectrum noise and discordant harmonics. It was the sound of brute force. He loaded the recording of the Yonaguni signal, that pure, impossible pulse, still beating its steady rhythm. Then, he overlaid the drilling profile. His algorithm was designed to identify and digitally subtract every frequency, every acoustic artifact associated with the Idemitsu drill. In theory, if Hagiwara was right, the screen should fall silent, the waveform flatlining into nothingness. With a final keystroke, he executed the program. For a moment, the screen flooded with cascading lines of code. Then, the waveform changed. The layer of chaotic, industrial noise vanished as the algorithm surgically excised it. But beneath it, the primary signal remained. The slow, perfect sine wave was still there, now pristine and unnervingly clear, like a whisper that had been hiding beneath a shout. Hagiwara was wrong. It wasn't interference. As Kenji stared, a fresh tremor alert flashed from a sensor near the Idemitsu rig. A new drilling cycle was beginning. On the main feed, a spike of raw noise erupted from the rig's location. And then Kenji saw it. The pure sine wave on his filtered monitor, the signal from deep within the rock, wavered. For a single terrifying beat, its frequency shifted, shortening from 1.2 seconds to 1.1. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but it was in perfect, instantaneous response to the drill starting miles away. It contracted, like a muscle tensing at a sudden sound. Then it settled back into its placid rhythm. A cold dread, colder than any he had felt before, washed over Kenji. This wasn't a recording. It wasn't a passive, looping broadcast. It was listening. Later, in the stark, obsessive neatness of his small apartment, the city lights of Yokosuka were a distant, silent nebula. The only light came from the glow of his laptop. Hagiwara had sealed the official channels, so Kenji had turned to the public ones, the ones he had once scorned. He pulled up the most detailed, high-resolution 3D sonar maps of the Yonaguni Monument available online, compiled from dozens of academic and amateur expeditions. The digital model floated on his screen, a submerged ghost of geometry. He cross-referenced the telemetry from his own triangulation of the signal S origin. With a trembling hand, he typed in the coordinates. The software processed the command, and a single red dot began to flash on the 3D model. It pulsed in time with the signal he knew was still beating, unheard, deep in the ocean. The dot wasn't T on the periphery of the structure. It was fixed directly over the center of the largest, most famous feature, a massive, flat terrace flanked by two enormous monoliths that rose to a 90-degree angle so perfect it looked cut by a blade. He zoomed in, the virtual camera plunging through the digital water. He saw the sharp corners, the stepped layers, the sheer flat face of the main platform. Geology doesn't use a T-square, he had told Rio with such confident disdain. The words now echoed in his silent apartment, a bitter mockery of his own certainty. The data, the irrefutable empirical data he worshipped, was pointing a blazing red arrow at the very thing he had dismissed as a fantasy. He wasn't just chasing a signal anymore. He was chasing a ghost that lived in a house he had sworn couldn't exist. The next day, Kenji walked into the deep-sea drone control room with the calm, authoritative air he knew was required to pull this off. The room was a dark cavern, lit only by the glow of monitors displaying data feeds from Jamstack-S fleet of remotely operated vehicles. He had spent the morning carefully falsifying a requisition order, burying the request for ROV Kaiko 7 deep inside a complex maintenance schedule. He approached the junior technician on duty, a young man named Ito. "Ito-san," Kenji said, his voice even. "I need Kaiko 7 for a few hours. I am running a diagnostic on sensor array 734. Need to get a visual to check for biofouling and calibrate for signal drift." Ito, eager to please the senior seismologist, nodded without question. "Of course, Tanaka-sensei. Which drone station do you want?" "Station 3 is fine," Kenji replied, pointing to a secluded control console in the corner. Minutes later, he was staring at the main screen as the powerful little ROV descended through the deep blue twilight of the East China Sea. On a secondary monitor, he had slaved to the console. A live feed of the 12 Hz signal pulsed, a constant reminder of his objective. His own heart pounded in his chest, a frantic biological rhythm trying to sync with the calm, mechanical beat on the screen. The dark, colossal shape of the monument emerged from the gloom, more imposing and real than any 3D model. It was a sheer wall of stone rising from the seabed, its scale humbling. Kenji's hands, slick with sweat, moved expertly over the drone-S controls. He was a scientist, but in that moment, he felt like a burglar, silently approaching a vault. He guided the ROV towards the large, flat terrace, the exact spot where his red dot had flashed. The drone-S manipulator arm, a marvel of engineering, unfolded from its housing. In its claw, it held a small, high-torque coring drill. This was the ultimate test of the scientific method. He had a hypothesis. The signal and the structure were one and the same. To prove it, he needed a sample. He needed to touch it. He guided the arm forward, the metal drill bit glinting in the ROV's lights, moving slowly, inexorably toward the ancient stone. The drill bit, no bigger than a man's thumb, touched the flat surface of the terrace. The instant the tungsten carbide made contact with the rock, the world broke. The calm blue sine wave on Kenji's monitor screamed. It instantly transformed into a chaotic, jagged waveform of immense amplitude, a red line of pure, shrieking energy. Simultaneously, a violent, localized tremor erupted directly beneath them. The entire control room facility, miles away on land, lurched sideways with a deafening groan of stressed steel. Monitors flickered. Ito cried out in shock, grabbing his console for support. Red alarm icons flashed across every screen, sirens blaring with the unmistakable signature of a major seismic event. On the main ROV screen, the camera feed convulsed, the image filled with a blizzard of static, the monument vanishing into electronic snow. But just before the feed cut out completely, a single green notification flashed in the corner of the screen. Sample acquired, container sealed, then silence. The tremor subsided as quickly as it had begun. The blaring alarms cut out. The only sounds were the panicked breathing of the technician and the faint hum of the backup power. The main screen was dead. The signal feed was dead. Kenji sat frozen, his hands still hovering over the controls. He had his proof. He had poked the anomaly, and the anomaly had triggered an earthquake. Ito swiveled in his chair, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the shock of the tremor. He stared at Kenji, a question forming on his lips that he was too afraid to ask. "Sensei." What was that? The small cylindrical core sample looked utterly unremarkable. It was a dull grey, barely 2 centimeters long, flecked with the kind of mineral deposits Kenji had seen 1,000 times. He handled it with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic, his hands steady despite the tremor that still echoed in his memory. In the sterile silence of the material analysis lab, a room he'd broken into using his now suspended credentials, he mounted the sample onto a slide and placed it under the electron microscope. He was a ghost in his own machine, a scientist turned outlaw, hunting for a truth that had already cost him his career. He started at low magnification, 100x. The image that resolved on the monitor was exactly what he expected, the pitted, weathered surface of Yaeyama sandstone. He felt a fleeting, absurd pang of disappointment. Had he imagined it all? Was the earthquake just a freak coincidence? He pushed the thought aside and increased the magnification, twisting the dial to 1000x. The landscape on the screen shifted. The random pitting began to resolve into a more defined, porous structure, like volcanic rock. Still natural, still explainable. He kept pushing. 10,000x. The image sharpened again, and Kenji's breath caught in his throat. This was no longer rock. The porous structure was a network of what looked like fossilized cell walls, hexagonal and interlocking with a frightening degree of uniformity. It looked less like geology and more like biology, a slice of ancient, petrified bone. But that wasn't the most astonishing part. Woven through the honeycomb of fossilized cells were other structures, shimmering, impossibly thin filaments that branched and converged, catching the electron beam with a metallic sheen, unlike any terrestrial element on the spectrograph. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pushed the magnification to its absolute limit, 100,000x. The screen resolved into a breathtaking vista of the utterly alien. The filaments were not random. They formed circuits, microscopic, intricate pathways connected by junctions of the same strange metal, woven directly into the biological matrix. It was a fusion of flesh and machine on a cellular level. It was something that could not possibly exist. Kenji leaned back, his own breath fogging the cold metal of the eyepiece. A single, paradigm-shattering thought crystallized in his mind, a whisper that toppled the entire edifice of his understanding. "It's not rock," he breathed into the silent room. It was grown. The images were afire in his hands. He burst into Director Hagawara's office without knocking, the tablet held out like a shield. On its screen, the alien latticework of the sample glowed, alongside the energy readings from the microscope's spectrometer spikes in the graph that corresponded to no known element. "Director, you have to see this. It's not interference. It's not drilling. The monument, it's biomechanical. A fusion of organic and synthetic material." For the first time, Hagiwara's mask of political calm shattered. He stared at the images on the tablet, and Kenji saw it clearly. A flicker of raw, undiluted fear in the director's eyes. The fear of a man seeing something he knows to be true but desperately wishes wasn't. The fear lasted only a second before it was buried under a hard shell of resolve. Hagiwara stood up, snatched a phone from his desk, and punched a single button. "Security to my office. Now! What are you doing?" Kenji demanded, his voice shaking with disbelief. "This is the single greatest discovery in human history. We have to tell someone. Issue a warning." 2 uniformed security guards entered the office, their faces impassive. Hagiwara pointed a steady finger at Kenji. "Dr. Tanaka, you are hereby placed on indefinite administrative leave pending an investigation into unauthorized use of agency assets, destruction of a multi-million yen ROV, and the deliberate falsification of scientific data." One of the guards gently but firmly took the tablet from Kenji's hands. The other stepped toward the desk, where Kenji had placed the sealed sample case. "You can do this," Kenji pleaded, his voice cracking. "The proof is right there." Hagiwara picked up the sample case, his expression cold as ice. "The Idemitsu project is vital for this nation's energy security. It will not be jeopardized by your imagination." He handed the case to the second guard. Kenji was escorted out, stripped of his ID, his tablet, his data, and the single, tiny piece of evidence that had rewritten the laws of nature. He was no longer a scientist. He was a heretic, excommunicated from the Church of Reason he had served his entire life. 2 days later, a man adrift walked onto the campus of Okinawa University. Kenji, stripped of his lab coat and dressed in wrinkled casual clothes, felt like a foreigner in a land he once knew. He found Professor Sato's office tucked away in a dusty corner of the Humanities building. It was a chaotic hoard of knowledge, the walls lined not with steel shelves, but with leaning towers of books, unrolled scrolls, and charcoal rubbings of ancient petroglyphs. Professor Sato, a man of 70, with eyes that sparkled with an energy that defied his age, had been Kenji's ancient history professor 20 years ago. Kenji had aced his class, but had privately dismissed the old man's pet theories linking Okinawan mythology to specific geological formations as charming academic nonsense. Now, he stood before him, a supplicant. Humbled, Kenji explained everything: the signal, the earthquake, the biomechanical structure, Hagiwara's betrayal. He left nothing out. Sato listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, nodding slowly. When Kenji finished, his story hanging in the dusty air, the old professor offered a sad, knowing smile. "You are a brilliant man, Kenji-san," Sato said softly. "You looked for the truth in the rock, and you found it. That is your gift. But your mistake was in thinking that science is the only way to read it. You should have started by listening to the stories the rock tells." That night, Sato's office was lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. The professor carefully unrolled a fragile yellowed scroll across his desk. It was a local Ryukyuan text, hundreds of years old. The faded ink depicted a fantastic creature, a great dragon, its body made not of scales but of sharp geometric lines and terraces. It was an unmistakable, stylized rendering of the Yonaguni Monument. "The old legends call it Umi-no-Ikari, the ocean's anchor," Sato translated, his finger tracing the ancient kanji. "They believed it was a living god that slept beneath the waves. The text says it keeps the islands from shaking. It inhales the earth's fever to calm the deep places." As Sato spoke those words, a frantic beeping erupted from Kenji's pocket. He pulled out a small, portable seismic sensor he'd managed to keep, a personal device he'd built himself. Its screen was flashing red. At the same moment, his phone buzzed with a news alert from the global seismology network. Flash. Magnitude 7.8. Earthquake strikes Philippine sea plate. Tsunami warning issued. Kenji's blood ran cold. He quickly toggled the display on his sensor, tuning it to the 12 Hz frequency. The signal from Yonaguni was back, but it was no longer a calm, steady pulse. It was beating twice as fast, a frantic, accelerated rhythm. And its amplitude, the sheer power of the signal, was 10 times stronger than anything he had recorded before. He looked from the beeping sensor in his hand to the ancient drawing of the sleeping dragon on the desk. Science and myth slammed together in his mind, fusing into a single, terrifying truth. The machine was awake. It was actively fighting the tectonic shockwave from the earthquake, just as the legend described. The dragon was inhaling the Earth's fever, and with the damage it had sustained from his drill, Kenji had no idea if it was strong enough to survive. The frantic beeping of the seismic sensor was the new metronome of their lives. In Professor Sato's cluttered office, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten history, Kenji worked with a desperate urgency he'd never known. Ancient scrolls and modern printouts lay side by side, the ink of scribes mingling with the toner of laser printers. The two worlds had collided, and the fallout was happening in real time on the tiny screen of Kenji's phone. He fed the new data, the accelerated frequency, the immense power output, into a simulation program he had designed years ago. It was meant to model volcanic pressure systems, but he de-adapted it on the fly, plugging in variables that were half geophysics, half nightmare. He watched as the simulation rendered the flow of tectonic energy. The recent earthquake was a massive river of force, and the monument, Umi-no-Ikari, was a dam, but it was a damaged dam. The simulation showed the energy pouring into the structure, but the output was choked, blocked. The fracture his drill had created, a microscopic wound on a colossal body, had crippled a key regulatory node. The machine could no longer vent the pressure it was absorbing. The energy had nowhere to go. It was simply accumulating, building, a capacitor charging to an impossible degree. Kenji's face went pale, the screen's glow reflecting in his horrified eyes. He looked at Sato. "It's not a dampener anymore," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "My drill, I broke its release valve. It is a pressure cooker. It's absorbing the entire 7.8 shockwave and building a mega quake." The ancient myth of the angry dragon wasn't just a story. It was a literal warning of this exact failure state. He hadn't just woken the dragon, he had enraged it. There was one last option, a desperate Hail Mary into the modern world he no longer belonged to. From a secure, encrypted connection at a public library, Kenji sent a compressed file, his data, his analysis, the electron microscope images he had secretly backed up to a fringe paranormal blogger he'd once ridiculed in a staff meeting. Within hours, the story was live. A headline in garish, bold letters screamed across a chaotic web page. Exclusive. Rogue Japanese scientist claims ancient underwater city is a doomsday machine. The official response was immediate and crushing. The next day, director Hagiwara stood at a polished podium, a bank of cameras flashing before him. He was the image of calm authority. Jamstack has been made aware of a baseless and frankly ludicrous rumor circulating on the internet, he announced, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Let me be clear. Our operations with our valued partner, the Idemitsu Corporation, are perfectly safe and adhere to the highest international standards. We will not be distracted by sensationalist fiction." He smiled, a politician's reassuring smile that made Kenji's stomach turn. Kenji watched the press conference on his phone, huddled in a cheap motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and defeat. The TV showed Hagiwara shaking hands with an Idemitsu executive. His data, his proof, had been dismissed as a ghost story. The establishment had closed ranks, its narrative impenetrable. He sank onto the lumpy bed, the phone slipping from his hand. He was out of options. The world refused to listen, and the clock was ticking on a catastrophe only he knew was coming. At sunset, Kenji stood with Sato on an old fishing dock, the sea a placid sheet of gold and orange. The air was still, belying the silent titanic forces gathering in the deep. "It's over," Kenji said, his voice hollow. "No one will believe us. We can stop it." Sato didn't answer. He pointed a crooked finger toward a small, weathered shrine at the end of the dock, dedicated to the local sea gods. On its side was a faded carving, an image Kenji now knew intimately. The geometric dragon, Umi-no-Ikari. But this carving had a detail the ancient scrolls lacked. At the Dragon S very center, a single point was depicted as a spiral, glowing with an inner light. The myths don't just speak of its anger, Kenji-san, Sato said quietly. They speak of how to soothe it, of a heartstone that can calm the storm. When a great typhoon comes, the fishermen here do not try to fight the waves. They look for the eye of the storm. We can stop the energy building in the machine, but perhaps we can help it release it. He turned to Kenji, his old eyes burning with a desperate fire. There is a private research submersible, the Triton. It's old, but it works. I have a friend. We can use it to reach this central node, the Heartstone. It is our only chance. Kenji stared at the carving, then at the old man beside him. Every rational instinct screamed that this was madness, a plan based on a fisherman-s fairy tale. But all his rational options were gone, crushed by the man on television. All he had left was the myth, the old man, and the terrifying data on his sensor. It was a leap into the abyss. "When can we go?" he asked. The deep blue of the abyss was both beautiful and terrifying. The small, battered submersible, Triton, descended like a stone into the twilight zone. Inside the cramped cockpit, Kenji piloted the craft, his knuckles white on the controls. Beside him, Sato monitored the ancient charts, cross-referencing them with the sub-S sonar. As they neared the monument, the water outside began to change. It shimmered with an eerie, visible energy, a soft golden corona that clung to the sub-S viewports. The machine was bleeding power, the pressure reaching a critical point. The monument itself pulsed with a soft internal light, like a dying giant. Suddenly, a sharp ping echoed through the cockpit. Sonar contact. Kenji's head snapped to the display. A larger, faster vessel was descending on them, its profile sleek and military grade. A Jamstack security submarine. "He found us," Kenji snarled, a wave of adrenaline washing away his despair. Hagiwara wasn't content to just discredit him. He had sent a hunter to stop him for good. He slammed the Triton S controls forward, pushing the old sub into a reckless dive. The security vessel answered, its powerful thrusters closing the distance with ease. A tense underwater chase began. Kenji weaved the smaller, more agile Triton through the massive, geometric canyons of the monument, dodging between colossal stone pillars that pulsed with golden light. It was a battle of two worlds, his small craft of heretical discovery against the brute force of the establishment, fighting a desperate race to the heart of a dying god. The security sub was faster and stronger, but the Triton was being piloted by a man with nothing left to lose. Kenji threw the small submersible into a tight, impossible turn, scraping its side against a glowing monolith of stone. He was aiming for a narrow fissure, a dark crack in the Monument-S architecture that the larger vessel couldn't possibly follow. They almost made it. A torpedo, not aimed to kill, but to disable, launched from the pursuing sub. It missed them, but the concussion was catastrophic. It struck the canyon wall nearby, and the resulting shockwave slammed into the Triton like the fist of a god. An explosion of sparks erupted from the main console. Red lights flashed, and alarms screamed a symphony of failure. The sub was thrown sideways, and Professor Sato, caught off guard, was hurled against a steel bulkhead. He slumped to the deck with a pained groan, a dark gash on his forehead. Kenji wrestled with the controls, fighting the sub's death throes. With the last of its momentum, he guided the crippled vessel into the dark crevice and killed the remaining systems. The alarms died, plunging them into a sudden, terrifying silence, broken only by the hiss of emergency oxygen and Sato's shallow breathing. The main power was gone. Darkness enveloped them. Kenji flicked on a battery-powered monitor, his hands shaking. The screen flickered to life, showing his simulation. The energy levels within the monument, represented by a rapidly ascending red line, were entering the final sector. The line edged toward a threshold marked Critical failure. They weren't out of time. They were seconds away from the end of it. Professor, Sato-sensei. Kenji crawled over to the old man. Sato's eyes fluttered open. He was groggy, disoriented, but his mind was still sharp. The sub is it, dead, Kenji said grimly. But the dive suit is still powered. He was already unlatching the emergency equipment locker, and the device is intact. Sato nodded weakly, pointing a trembling finger at the monitor. Then you must go. There is no other way. In the cold, pressurized silence of the deep, Kenji emerged from the sub's airlock. He wore a high-tech Jamstack dive suit, a relic of a life that no longer felt like his own. In his gloved hands, he carried a small, cylindrical device he and Sato had cobbled together, a counter-frequency resonator designed to introduce a harmonic disruption, hopefully forcing a controlled energy release. It was a scientific prayer, based on a mythological map. "I am outside," he said into his comm. Sato's voice crackled back, faint and strained. The scrolls, they show paths of energy like veins leading to the heart. You must see them. Kenji looked, and he understood. The shimmering golden corona he'd seen earlier was not random. It was a network of flowing light, streams of pure energy coursing through channels carved into the monument's alien structure. He was floating in a place of impossible, breathtaking grandeur, a cathedral built by a forgotten science. The water around him was turbulent, the energy building toward its final, terrible crescendo. "I see them," Kenji said, his voice filled with awe. "The lines of light, they converge." "Follow them, Kenji-san," Sato whispered over the comm. "Follow them to the heart." Propelled by the suiter's small thrusters, Kenji pushed off from the dead submersible and swam into the glowing, violent currents. A lone figure navigating the collapsing arteries of a dying god. He followed the converging streams of light deeper into the structure, arriving in a vast central chamber. The light here was almost blinding. All the energy pathways terminated at a single colossal stone suspended in the center of the chamber by tendrils of living rock. It was the Heartstone from the ancient carving, and it pulsed with a furious rhythmic light, each beat sending a visible shockwave through the water. The low 12 Hz hum was now an audible, deafening thrum that vibrated through the very bones of his skull. This was the epicenter of the storm. He raised the counter-frequency device, preparing to make his final approach. Suddenly, the chamber was flooded with a harsh, artificial glare. The Jamstack security submarine emerged from a passage above him, its powerful floodlights pinning him against the pulsating stone. A voice, distorted by the water and electronics, crackled over his comm. It was Hagiwara. "Abort, Doctor. That's an order. You don't know what you're doing. You will doom us all." Kenji froze, caught between the voice of the world he knew and the impossible truth before him. He looked at the massive, powerful submarine, the symbol of the establishment, of reason without wisdom. Then he looked at the device in his hands, a fusion of science and myth. He looked at the pulsating Heartstone, the source of a power beyond human comprehension. Hagiwara was wrong. He finally knew exactly what he was doing. He ignored the order. With a final, desperate surge, he pushed forward and shoved the device onto the stone's surface. Magnetic locks engaged with a heavy clank, securing it in place. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a silent, blinding wave of pure golden energy erupted from the Heartstone. It engulfed Kenji, the submarine, the entire chamber. The light was absolute, a white fire that consumed everything. Months later, Kenji Tanaka stood at a podium in a hushed international conference hall, facing the world's most brilliant scientific minds. He was no longer the haunted, desperate man from the motel room. He was calm, confident, his gaze steady. Behind him, a massive screen displayed not a complex graph or a seismic chart, but two images side by side. A high-resolution electron microscope image of the monument's biomechanical cells, and a crisp, clear photograph of Professor Sato's ancient scroll. For more than 10,000 years, the truth of Umi-no-Ikari was not lost, Kenji said, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the hall. It was simply written in a language that modern science had forgotten how to read. We saw the numbers, but we missed the poetry. We measured the rock, but we ignored the story. He paused, letting his words sink in. We were wrong. To understand our world, to face the challenges ahead, we must learn to read all the languages of truth again, the language of data and the language of myth. His final slide appeared on the screen. It was a live drone feed from the coast of Yonaguni. The water was calm. The monument below was silent and dark, its golden light extinguished. And circling it, standing guard, was not a single security sub, but an international fleet of research vessels, their flags a tapestry of newfound global cooperation. The dragon was asleep once more, and this time the world was watching over it. What happens when a fact doesn't feel like the whole truth? The story of Kenji Tanaka and the Yonaguni Monument pushes right into that uncomfortable space. We start with a man of pure science, someone who trusts data and dismisses folklore as just seeing faces in the clouds. And you can't blame him. Science is powerful. It gives us a clear, testable framework for reality. But the story's brilliance is how it uses Kenji's own rigorous methods to lead him somewhere his science alone can't explain. The data becomes a signal without a context, a mystery without a meaning. It is only when he's forced to listen to Professor Sato's ancient myths, the story of a sleeping dragon that calms the earth, that the data suddenly clicks into place. The myth wasn't an alternative to the truth. It was a user's manual for it, passed down through generations. It makes you wonder. The story isn't really arguing that myths are more true than science. Instead, it seems to suggest that maybe they are two essential parts of a whole. Science provides the schematics, but the ancient stories provide the soul, the warning, the accumulated wisdom of human experience. Kenji's journey wasn't about abandoning science for superstition. It was about realizing that to see the complete picture, he needed both the telescope and the scroll. It leaves me with a really interesting question. When have you felt that a purely scientific or logical explanation for something just wasn't enough? That there was a deeper, more human story that held the real truth?